Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. It's always fascinating to see how what we eat, or in this case, when we eat, can have such a huge impact on our health.
It really is.
Today, we're diving into some pretty cool research that suggests there might be a link between intermittent fasting and the body's ability to fight cancer.
Right. And this research particularly focuses on the role of these natural killer cells.
Oh, NK cells.
Yeah, NK cells. So basically these awesome little white blood cells that can spot and then eliminate cancerous or infected cells in the body.
So they're kind of like the body's own security force, always on patrol, looking for anything suspicious.
Exactly. They're constantly scanning for threats.
So what's fasting got to do with all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The study we're looking at today, which is published in Immunity, found that intermittent fasting can actually supercharge these NK cells, making them even more effective at taking out those cancer cells.
Wait, so you're saying that just changing the timing of meals actually made a difference in how well these mice could fight tumors?
Precisely. The researchers put mice with tumors on an intermittent fasting regimen, and they actually saw some pretty remarkable results.
Oh, so tell me, what kind of regimen are we talking about here?
Well, for this study, the mice fasted for 1 day and then had 2 days of normal eating. They repeated this cycle for 3 weeks.
Okay, so 1 day on, 2 days off for 3 weeks straight. What happened? Did the fasting make any difference in how those tumors grew?
The results were honestly pretty amazing. The mice who fasted had tumors that were, on average, 40% smaller than the tumors in the control group.
Wow, 40%. That's a huge difference. But how can we be sure it was the NK cells responsible for shrinking those tumors and not just, say, the reduced calorie intake from fasting?
That's a great question. And to figure that out, the researchers did something really clever. They used antibodies to deplete the NK cells in some of the fasted mice.
Ah, very smart. So take away their NK cells and see what happens.
Exactly. And what they found was that without NK cells, even with the fasting regimen, the tumors in those mice grew much larger.
Oh, wow. So no NK cells, no tumor reduction, even with fasting. That's pretty convincing evidence.
It is. It really highlights how critical these NK cells are in this whole process.
Okay, so we know NK cells are key, but how does fasting actually work on a cellular level to make them so powerful? What's going on there?
Well, there seem to be a couple of key changes that fasting triggers. First, the researchers found that the NK cells in the spleen, which is one of the organs that filters our blood, those were actually surviving during the fasting periods, while other types of immune cells were actually decreasing.
So while other cells are struggling, the NK cells are thriving. Interesting. What's the secret to their success?
Well, it seems they adapted to using a different kind of fuel source. You see, normally cells rely on glucose for energy, but during these fasting periods, the splenic NK cells actually switched over to using fatty acids.
Ah, so they're basically switching from burning sugar to burning fat. Pretty resourceful.
It is. They're finding a way to keep going, even when their usual fuel source is scarce.
Oh.
And this switch doesn't just keep them alive. It seems to enhance their ability to, well, kill those tumor cells.
That's amazing. So it's not just about keeping the NK cells alive, but making them even better at eliminating threats. Were there any other changes besides this fuel switch?
Yes, actually. The researchers also observed some changes happening in the bone marrow, which is where NK cells are produced. They found that fasting increased the expression of genes involved in the IL-12 signaling pathway.
Now, remember you mentioning the IL-12 pathway earlier. Can you remind me what it does again?
Of course. So IL-12 is like a training program for NK cells, boosting their effectiveness against tumor cells. It's like giving them better weapons and training to be even more effective soldiers.
Right, so not just fuel, but better weapons and training too. What happens because of this enhanced IL-12 signaling? What's the outcome?
Well, it leads to an increase in the production of interferon gamma, or IFN. This is like the heavy artillery that gets deployed against those tumor cells.
Got it. So fasting basically sets off this chain reaction. It changes the fuel source for NK cells, then boosts the IL-12 signaling, and ultimately we get a surge in IFN. Basically, it gives the immune system a major boost in fighting those cancer cells.
Exactly. It's this amazing cascade of events that leads to a much stronger immune response.
And here's something even more fascinating. The researchers found that even after the mice went back to their normal eating schedule, their NK cells continued to produce more IFN than those in the mice who hadn't fasted.
It's like fasting leaves this lasting impact on these cells, keeping them primed and ready for action even after the fasting period is over.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like giving the immune system a memory boost, specifically targeting cancer. This is all super exciting stuff, but before we get too carried away, we need to remember that this research was done in mice. What about us humans? Can we expect to see these same effects?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at the research that's been done in humans, including a clinical trial that combined fasting with standard cancer therapies. So stay tuned for that.
Welcome back, everyone. Before we move on to the human studies, I'm curious about this metabolic switch in NK cells. How does that actually make them better at fighting cancer? It's cool that they can switch from sugar to fat for fuel, but how does that translate into actually destroying tumor cells more effectively?
That's a great question. And honestly, scientists are still trying to work out all the details. But one theory is that this shift to burning fat increases the production of reactive oxygen species inside the NK cells.
Reactive oxygen species, those are,
They're also known as ROS.
Yeah.
And they're basically highly toxic to cancer cells, like a really potent weapon against them.
So it's like giving them this extra dose of firepower aimed specifically at the cancer cells.
Exactly. It's a targeted attack. But there's more to it than just the metabolic switch. Remember how we talked about fasting boosting the IL-12 signaling pathway, which gives NK cells better training and weapons to fight cancer?
Right. The training program and the weapons upgrade.
Exactly. Well, that pathway is really important because it's linked to the NK cell's ability to produce interferon gamma. Remember that heavy artillery we talked about?
Yeah, I remember IFN.
Right. And what's really interesting is that this increase in IFN production doesn't just stop when the fasting period ends. Researchers found that even after the mice went back to their regular eating patterns, their NK cells continued to produce more IFNI than those in mice that hadn't fasted at all.
So it's like the fasting gave their immune system a kind of muscle memory, training it to be more vigilant and ready to respond to cancer threats even after the fasting is over.
Yeah, it's a powerful concept. It really highlights how dietary interventions like fasting can have these long-lasting effects on our immune systems. But it is important to remember that all this research we've discussed has been in mice.
Yeah, good point. We can't get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about humans. Does any research suggest this might work for people too? You mentioned a clinical trial earlier, right?
Right. This trial involved 101 cancer patients who were already getting standard cancer therapies like chemotherapy. And the researchers added a 5-day fasting mimicking diet to their treatment plan.
So not a complete fast, but something designed to trigger the same kinds of metabolic changes we saw in the mice study.
Precisely. It was carefully designed to mimic those effects while still providing essential nutrients.
Makes sense. So what happened? Did this fasting mimicking diet have any impact on how the patients did?
The results were encouraging. The patients who followed the fasting mimicking diet, they showed improvements in their anti-tumor immunity. And it looks like a big part of that improvement was due to an increase in their NK cell populations.
Okay, that's really promising. So even a short period of mimicking the effects of fasting could potentially enhance the effectiveness of conventional cancer treatments.
It really could. But of course, we need a lot more research before we can recommend fasting as a standard part of cancer treatment. There's still a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Like what? What are some things that we need to figure out?
Well, for one thing, we need to figure out the optimal fasting regimens for different types of cancer, and different people, too. What works for one person might not work for another.
Right. Everyone is different.
Exactly. And there could be risks involved, especially for people who are already frail or have certain health conditions. It's not something to be taken lightly. Anyone thinking about trying this should absolutely talk to their doctor first.
Yeah, 100%. It's important to be cautious and talk to a healthcare professional, especially since all this is still pretty early in terms of research. What are some other areas where researchers are focusing their efforts? Where do we go from here?
Well, one area is exploring the long-term effects of fasting on the immune system. We've seen the short-term benefits, but what happens over time? Are there any downsides to repeated or prolonged fasting?
Right. We have to make sure the benefits outweigh any potential risks, especially when it comes to something as important as our immune system. What about other research? Are there any other promising avenues scientists are exploring?
Well, there's growing interest in developing therapies that can mimic the effects of fasting without requiring people to actually fast.
Oh, that's interesting. So like a medication or something that could trigger those same positive changes in the immune system.
Exactly. That's the goal. If we can figure out how fasting works at the cellular level, we might be able to replicate those effects with a targeted therapy.
That would be incredible. But for now, it seems the best way to experience these potential benefits is to, well, actually fast. And as you said, talk to your doctor first. This has been a really eye-opening conversation, but we've still got a lot to learn. What do you see as the future of this research? What are some big, unanswered questions scientists are wrestling with?
I think one of the most pressing questions is understanding exactly how fasting affects different types of cancer cells. We've seen some promising results, but there's a lot of variation.
So not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. We need to figure out why it seems to work better for some cancers than others. And are there certain cancers where fasting might not be beneficial or even potentially harmful?
Right. More research is needed. What else?
We also need a better understanding of how fasting interacts with other cancer treatments.
Yeah.
Like chemotherapy and radiation. Can it enhance their effectiveness? Or could it interfere?
Right. It's huge. And what about the timing of the fasting? Is it better to fast before, during, or after cancer treatments? Or maybe a combination?
Exactly. So many variables to consider. And then there are the long-term effects. Does fasting need to be continuous? Or can we make those changes more permanent?
It sounds like we're just scratching the surface of what we can learn about this connection between fasting, the immune system, and cancer. It's fascinating.
It is. There's so much potential. And this research on fasting is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We're learning more and more about how everything is connected, lifestyle choices, genes, environment, overall health.
It really is an exciting time for research. But before we wrap up completely, there's one more thing I want to touch on.
Okay, what's that?
We've talked a lot about the physical, the cellular effects of fasting, but I think we should also consider the psychological and emotional aspects. Fasting, even for short periods, can be tough. It takes discipline, and it can be uncomfortable. If fasting does become a more common recommendation, how can we help people manage those challenges?
That's such a great point. It's not just about the science. We need to make sure people have the support and resources they need to fast safely and effectively if they choose to.
This brings us to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll look at some of the bigger picture implications of all of this research. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into fasting and its potential in the fight against cancer. We've covered a lot of ground already, haven't we? From the inner workings of cells to research in mice and humans, and even some of those challenges and questions that are still out there. But now I think it's time to step back and look at the bigger picture, the broader implications of this research. What do you think?
I agree. I think it's important to zoom out a bit and see where this all fits.
Exactly. So what does all this research tell us about the connection between our bodies, our lifestyle choices, and ultimately our health?
Well, I think it's pretty profound, honestly. For so long, the focus has been on treating diseases after they've developed, right? But this research on fasting and those amazing NK cells, it really highlights the potential for using lifestyle interventions like fasting as a powerful tool for preventing disease in the first place.
It's almost like we have this incredible power within us to influence our own health and well-being just by making conscious choices about how we live, what we eat, when we eat. It's empowering, isn't it?
It really is. I think this research challenges us to rethink our whole approach to health. It's not just about reacting to illness. It's about being proactive and taking steps to boost our body's natural defenses and resilience. And this isn't just limited to cancer. We're seeing some really exciting results in research on fasting and its effects on other conditions too. Things like autoimmune disorders, heart disease, even neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
So this could be just the beginning, right? The tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding how these simple lifestyle changes can ripple out and impact our whole health landscape. That's a pretty hopeful message, don't you think? Especially at a time when chronic diseases are on the rise.
I think it's very hopeful. It suggests we might have more control than we realize.
Right. It's not all predetermined. So what's the key takeaway here?
I'd say it's that we're not just passive bystanders. We can actually participate in shaping our own health destinies. And fasting is just one example of a lifestyle intervention that can make a huge difference. But it's not the only one, of course. You've got regular exercise, stress management, quality sleep. All these things play a role.
It's about taking a more holistic approach, right? Recognizing that our bodies are these complex systems and that everything is interconnected.
Absolutely. It's about moving away from just focusing on disease and moving toward a more health-centric approach. And it's about recognizing that we each have a unique biology. What works for one person might not work for another. There's no one-size-fits-all.
And that's where personalized medicine comes in, right? Where treatments and lifestyle recommendations are tailored to an individual's needs and even their genetic makeup.
Exactly. In the future, we might be able to use things like genetic testing and other biomarkers to actually predict how someone might respond to fasting or other lifestyle interventions.
That would be amazing. Imagine being able to personalize those recommendations and ensure that people are getting the most benefit with the least risk.
It's an exciting possibility, and it's a future I think we're moving toward.
It's a future where we're not just managing diseases, but actually promoting health and well-being at an individual level. That's exciting.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We explored the fascinating science behind how fasting might boost our natural defenses against cancer. And we acknowledge that there's still so much to learn, like those long-term effects, optimal fasting regimens, and how to personalize this approach for different people and different types of cancer. It's a journey of discovery, really. It is, and it's rapidly evolving. This research on fasting is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Yeah.
We're constantly learning more about those intricate connections between our lifestyle choices, our genes, our environment, and our health as a whole. It's fascinating.
It really is. And it's empowering to know that we can play an active role in shaping our own health outcomes.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and maybe even inspired you to explore a little further on your own.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.